Hello, attorney broker John McConnin, and we are going to be looking at the California Purchase and Sale Agreement. We're going to try to break this up into 5-minute blocks. This first block, we're going to do a little bit of intro. Maybe we'll get into the first paragraph and what's important. The first thing, other than if you're an attorney and you want to counsel your clients and see what they're trying to accomplish, you might want to give them the background of the fact that these forms are very slanted towards buyers and that they give buyers a lot of outs. The theory behind this is that it makes it easy for a buyer to make an offer. Sellers want offers, and therefore it's easy for the buyer to make an offer because if they're not satisfied with the inspection or for many other reasons, they can get out. Now, that's not in a seller's market. That might not be what the seller wants. You want to discuss these things with the seller. You might want to strike out some of these clauses that protect buyers, or in what I've worked with when working with high-end clients. Especially when there's a sophisticated buyer and a seller on high-end properties, they sometimes just go down in 1, 2, 3-page agreements. So this is an agreement that's designed for a balanced market to encourage buyers to make offers. And, you should know that when you're looking at these forms. The next thing, so that's what I like to talk to my people about, and then they can make decisions. But the next thing, or maybe this should even be the first thing, you want to make sure you're working with the most recent agreement if you're working with the California Residential Purchase Agreement that's put out by CAR. Now, as an attorney, I like to work with it because there's an advantage to drafting clauses. And if you're looking at someone else's work, it takes much more brain power and there can be many more mistakes. So I really don't like working with other people's forms unless my clients are really understand that a lot of money can be spent just reviewing the contract. So it's not really in a lot of people's interest to do it that way. Maybe in the interest of the seller to set it up that way, or the buyer, but the person on the other side might not want that. So the first thing I want to do is to make sure I'm working with the most recent forms, because the older forms, sometimes buyers, especially investors, like to work with the older ones because there are certain things in those forms that buyers, particularly investors, found advantageous. So once again, today we're working with the 1215 contract. I would always check to make sure that's what we're working with. So especially if you're familiar with them over time, you're like, oh, it's a boilerplate clause. There's no changes in it, so I'm comfortable with it. I've read it 100 times. So now the next thing, and this was an improvement on this form, date prepared. This no longer confuses people and say it's the date of the contract. No, this is the date prepared. The date of the contract will be later on, in my opinion. This is the preparation date. It gets referred to as the preparation date later. So that's a good thing. Now the offer, this is an offer from Test Buyer 2 and 3 and 4. I just put that in there because when you're making the forms, they do not want you to make blank forms. As part of the copyright protections, they make it difficult for realtors using the forms to just put out blank ones, so we can't just give them away for cheap, I think is the theory. So anyway, I was just filling it out randomly. So here's a 4-buyer situation. I just went Test Buyer 1, Test Buyer 2, then I got tired of it and typed in 3, 4. The real property to be acquired is 1 Gulf and Ocean View, San Diego, California 92064. That's really Poway. I just typed that in quickly. You can see that it's identified here, the purchase price. Now, this is going to be important to people, and, that's one of the things you're going to look at. Close of escrow. This is always an interesting clause because sometimes it's hard to close on time. Buyers and sellers might want to be at 30 days, but if there's been a lot of refi going on and loans involved, 30 days might be... especially with the new changes in the beginning of the year, it's sometimes hard for lenders to close in 30 days. So you may want to be speaking with lenders at the time you are working on these things, because maybe 40 days is more realistic. Some lenders promise they can do 21-day closes. So if you see 21 days in here, you might want to double check with the lender to make sure that's actually going to happen. Because sometimes people start depending on these closing dates, especially if they're framing a sale and then a purchase. I sort of like days after acceptance, but it's a variable some people aren't comfortable with. Buyers and sellers are referred to here as parties. Brokers are not parties to this agreement. Disclosure. The parties each acknowledge receipt of a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. That is usually now, it sort of comes out automatically. It's back here, disclosure regarding real estate relationships. And this is basically set up so that realtors can really double-side transactions. Now, the lawyer in me despised this. I was a lawyer first since 91, before I became a realtor. And I was always completely against the idea of buyers and sellers being represented by the same realtor. Because I've been in the industry and I've gotten accustomed to making money, I've mentally come up with all sorts of reasons why it's okay to represent both sides as long as you're explaining to both sides what you're doing. But I understand if you're a lawyer why you would challenge that concept. I will say at times it's good to be in control of the buyer, not because you're controlling the buyer, but because it's the lender that can create all sorts of problems at late dates in the contract. Like, you'd want the problems to happen up front, but lenders always tell you everything's wonderful up front. And it's those last few days that can be very problematic. And I think that, well, there's lots of things you can talk to a buyer, but I think if you're working with a buyer and you explain, hey, I'm going to explain what's really going on with the lender to the seller so everyone can make good decisions, as long as that's discussed ahead of time, I think it can be useful for both sides. If one person is representing both sides. Or at least it can be okay for the seller if your agent is also representing the buyer. I'm not sure that's the greatest thing in the world for the buyer, but sometimes buyers want the property and they're willing to put up with dual representation. So finally, if you are a buyer and you are working with the seller's realtor, you may want to hire an attorney to oversee the transaction or oversee. An attorney can work for less, and maybe they'll even make a referral. I've set it up so I can refer the file over to the listing agent. I still take 25% or whatever I worked out with the buyer, and I can represent the buyer well. The buyer still feels like they can get to the front of the line and get the job done. I think it's a very good way to do things. So that's the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. It basically allows realtors to do things that attorneys might find questionable. Now here's where we write in who's who, and this is good because in the past buyers didn't necessarily know that they were working with someone who was representing the seller. Over time, it's now become buyer's agent, seller's agent, where in the past it used to be listing agent, selling agent, and they were really both working. They had duties to the seller, but not necessarily the buyer. That's changed over time. This lays it out. I like it a lot. This also explains the fact that your realtor may be working with two buyers trying to buy the same property. It's possible. You might want to get comfortable with that, or you might want to say, no, I'm not comfortable with that. Finance terms. Now, here is, let me see how we're doing. We're already over the 5 minutes, so we're going to discuss that in the next video.